Hello, and welcome to episode 3 of Pax Americana, a conversation about world affairs, global conflict, and today, military strategy. Today, I want to talk about military strategy, particularly a subtype called naval strategy, and the reasons are the following. For one thing, I want to try to stake out the territory just early in this show, because this is the third episode, so that people know that moving forward, this is one of the topics that we're going to be talking about. The other reason is because, as some of you know, I read a lot about military strategy, and lately I have been completely obsessed with a French naval strategist named Admiral Raoul Castex. And naval strategy is simply what's on my mind. And usually whenever I have anything on my mind, I get excited about it. And when I'm excited about something, I want to talk about it. So that's why I want to talk about it today. Speaking of Castex, I am going to talk about Castex. I'm also going to talk about Alfred Theremin and Julian Corbett. And these three people are what I like to describe as the holy trinity of naval strategy. That being said, this is not a deep dive. I'm not going to get into depth in either of these men's works. I promise that's coming. There will be episodes on all of these three. But what I want to do is I want to talk about some of like the top level stuff about naval strategy, the stuff that I'm finding really super interesting as I read Castex and I read about Mahan and Corbett, and things that I think are actually interesting outside of the normal question of military strategy, and it's something that I think even non-experts could find interesting. And this show, thus, today is meant for those of you who aren't actually experts in naval strategy or military strategy, those of you who probably have never heard of Mahan or Castex or Corbett, let alone read them. So this show is for you. Hopefully those of you who have read them will also find this interesting, but you're not my target audience for the day. So again, this is a subject I'm very excited to be talking about, so here I am talking about it. Now, I want to break it down and talk about what are these big top-level items in naval strategy that I find so interesting. First, there's a whole question of sea power. What is it? What's it for? It seems like an obvious thing, but it isn't obvious because it's hard to understand, particularly in this day and age. What do we need navies for? I mean, we haven't fought a naval battle in a very long time, we being in the United States. It's been, what, since World War II? What are navies even for? What is sea power for? Do you need navies for sea power? What's the point of sea power? What's it good for? Second, there's this other issue that I find super interesting, which has to do with the question of the impact of technology on things like strategy. So there's basically, the argument often is made that because technology is advancing so quickly, that there's really no way that you can think about something like the art of war, right? Sun Tzu's book, which I think dates to before the Common Era, so the birth of Jesus. So how could that be relevant, given that so much has changed? And now we see that the pace of technological change is even increasing. So therefore, it always begs the question of maybe things are so different now that any lessons that might be learned from history are actually kind of irrelevant. And again, even outside from naval strategy, I find that's just a fundamentally interesting question. Third, there's this question that the naval strategists debate, which has to do with what you do with an actual navy. In other words, okay, you've got a navy, you're going to fight another country that has a navy, so what do you do, right? And what should the point of your navy be? And what is the objective? What are your goals? What do you focus on? And generally the argument is that you should use your navy in order to fight other navies, which also means that you need to have a navy that can fight other navies. But there are others who say, well, maybe not. And then it gets interesting, because then there's a sort of interesting historical debate, and it's almost a philosophical debate about like, well, okay, we agree that we need a navy, but what for? To do what? And then finally, what I want to talk about today is this question of, well, what about today? Like, what are the lessons? Okay, we've talked about these guys. We've talked about naval strategy. So what does this mean for us today in terms of our geopolitical situation with Taiwan, China, the Red Sea, the Straits of Taiwan? What do we do? Defense budgets, where do we spend our money? That sort of thing. So I do want to talk about that. So let's start with this first issue, sea power. the very idea of sea power really, in the modern context, goes back to Alfred Thayer Mann. And Mann is the grandfather of naval strategy. He's chronologically speaking, he's basically the first of these people, but he's the one who sort of sets the standard. And after him, everybody's referring to him. Like, it's always about him, responding to him, disagreeing with him, agreeing with him, but it's always about him, ultimately. And he also, because of the time in which he was writing, the time of which he was writing in the late 19th century, he very much set the tone for his target audience, which was the United States, the United States government, the United States Navy. He was a naval officer, and a lot of his writing could be described as a gigantic op-ed in favor of the United States becoming a great power. And his argument was that in order for the United States to become a great power, the United States needs to have sea power. And in order to have sea power, it has to have a navy that can deliver the sea power. And the way he does this is he uses history. He writes about a lot of historical cases to argue that present empires, past empires, would rise and fall largely because of sea power. That in the end of the day, it's because of sea power. Even armies or empires that you don't normally think about as being sea powers, like the Roman Empire, he says, no, it's a sea power. For all the great empires in the world, it's always sea power. You need sea power. That's the prerequisite for global power, is sea power. And therefore, the United States, to be a big power, needs sea power, right? And then therefore, it needs a navy that can deliver that sea power. But that's his main argument, and that's the argument that I believe greatly influenced the United States in the growth of the U.S. Navy. Again, he's writing then in the 19th century. This is also a moment when the United States begins to think about itself as a global power. We have the Spanish-American War, so we conquer the Philippines, which makes us a Pacific power, even more so. We conquer Puerto Rico and Cuba, and we go about expanding our power. And a lot of this then aligns with this push, like America is now a global power, which means we need a navy. And people in the United States believe this. They believe in sea power, ultimately because they've all read Mann, and because of his influence. And his influence is even greater than that too, in the extent that the British are reading him, the French are reading him, everybody's reading Mann. He's it. There's no real disagreement here from Corbett or Castex, except that there is a sense, I think with Castex more than Mann, a sense that, a little bit more sense of proportion in that, yes, sea power is essential, but let's not forget that ultimately sea power is seldom decisive. Wars are seldom won or lost on the ocean. They're won or lost on land, which is where people are. And of course, sea power plays a critical supporting role, but often it's a supporting role rather than the main show. So that's just sort of like a little bit of nuance that you can find under Castex, and I don't think Corbett disagrees with that. But let's get to this question about this idea of naval strategy and technology. And again, I think this is very interesting. If you think about the history of navies, right, or warfare, I mean, things have changed a lot, and they've changed even more so even in the last few decades, certainly in the 20th century, but certainly in the last few decades. With warships, with navies, you know, you've gone from having these galleys with guys rowing in them, and maybe they would ram each other, and then you go to ships with sails, and then they would fire cannon at each other, and then they would board each other, and then you got this sort of like, you know, master and commander sort of thing. And then you've got these, you go from that, and very quickly then you get steam power, and then ironclads, and then before you know it, you've got these gigantic dreadnoughts, these gigantic steel battleships with these huge cannon that are firing at each other, and then you've got aircraft carriers. And today we have this phenomenon where modern warships, rather than being these stout oak ships or these gigantic steel battleships, they're these actually very fragile things that are just stuffed full of electronics and sensors. And it's all this game of who can sense whom first and get off the first shot, right? And coordinate the shots. And it's all about the software, and again, the sensors, and being able to feed the sensor information into the missiles, and then you fire the missiles, and that's what it is. And it's often done, you know, if you can imagine what a modern battle would be, it's like ships that don't even see each other, right? They don't even know that the other's there. It's just that satellites or some other sensors detect the enemy, feed the enemy on these information networks that go into the ship, and then the ship is able to load this information into one of its missiles, and it fires the missile, again at something that it can't see, it can't itself detect, and the other ship might be doing the same thing. And you've got these duels that might be going on. But either way, it's super complicated. So when you look at the technology, you have to wonder, gosh, so much has changed. Can one even talk about an art of war? And I mean, we got Sun Tzu's famous book, The Art of War, but more importantly, in the modern era, we have Clausewitz, who studied war and basically said, there is some kind of eternal qualities of war that we can deduce from a study of the history of war and what we know about war, and that these truths about war are more or less eternal. And the emphasis is then placed on this sort of eternal nature of war. And after Clausewitz, all these other people sort of pile on, and then there's this notion that never mind the technology, war is war, and there's certain truths of war. And then you end up with books like, we've got Marshall Foch's book, The Principles of War, and Foch basically boils it down to how you've got principles of war, and these principles of war are more or less eternal. And Foch uses history in order to argue, to make this case, right? And interesting enough, but Foch wrote his book before World War I, but then of course he's involved in World War I, and he came up with other editions during the war, and each one in the preface he'd say, you know what, everything's the same. And then after World War I, he says, you know what, everything's the same. Yes, technology has changed, but everything ultimately is the same. How you do things, the tactics, the techniques, those things differ, but ultimately there's some fundamental truths. Now, in terms of naval warfare, the debate breaks down into two schools of thought. You've got the historical school and the material school. The historical school, and Mahan, Corbett, and Castex all belong to the historical school, follow Clausewitz's lead, and in Castex's case, also Foch's lead, and in this belief that ultimately, if you look at history, you can deduce from military history some eternal truths, and these eternal truths are true notwithstanding technological changes. How you do the things that you need to do are very different, right? So battleships today, Castex would say, still serve the same purpose as they always did. It's just that now they also have to defend against aircraft, or defend against submarines, or they have to think differently, and they have to operate in a little different manner. But ultimately, naval warfare is the same that it even was in the 17th century. I mean, the bad part about this argument is that it makes these books kind of tedious to read, because Mahan, Castex, Corbett, their books are full of these long vignettes and anecdotes where they're reaching into the, for us, very distant past, but they're reaching into the Anglo-Dutch wars of the 17th and 18th centuries, and then these 18th century wars, like the Wars of the Spanish Succession and the 7 Years' War, and aspects even of the wars that we're familiar with, that we're not familiar with, right? We all know about World War I. We don't know much about naval operations in World War I. And they're writing about these elegies to guys like de Ruyter or the French commander Suffren, and of course they all kind of have a, to use a technical academic term, they all have a hard-on for Nelson. And it's all about history, and it's hard to read for us, usually because we don't actually know what they're talking about. I mean, I'm not really familiar with a lot of these battles and these wars. I'm not familiar with the Anglo-Dutch naval wars. I really don't know who de Ruyter is. I only know who Suffren is because I went and read their things very carefully and spent a lot of time on Wikipedia. One of them, I think Castex writes a lot about this Battle of Lagos, this great naval battle, and I thought, oh my God, there was a naval battle off the coast of Nigeria. Sure enough, I Googled, and no, I think it's off the coast of Portugal, but I'm not really sure. The point is, it makes the books kind of hard to read because we don't know these things. But again, ultimately, at the end of the day, what they're saying is that technology doesn't really matter that much. And I know that Castex comes down and basically says, yeah, Foch is right, that the principles of war remain in place, notwithstanding all the changes. Now, the counter-argument is the material school. And the material school, or sometimes called the materialist school, basically says that, like, stop talking about the Anglo-Dutch wars or Suffren or de Ruyter or Nelson. None of that really matters because everything is so different that it's kind of pointless. We have to kind of keep rethinking as we go. And with naval warfare, this is really compelling when you talk about the sort of the change from like the wooden ships to the steel dreadnoughts of the end of the 19th and early 20th century, and then certainly today, right, with today's computers and digital technology. And the materialist school's biggest, most concrete incarnation in naval history was something that emerged in France in the end of the 19th century called the Jeune École. And what the Jeune École was this argument that the French were watching the British build this huge battleship fleet and thinking like, A, we can't afford that. B, maybe it's a bad idea. And why is it a bad idea? Well, it's a bad idea because I think they're wrong that what Mahan says, that fleets' purpose should be to destroy other fleets. Like, that's not right. There's a different understanding, and I'll talk about that a little bit more later. But also, you've got these new technologies like torpedoes that render these battleships really vulnerable. So the British could go ahead and they could build these gigantic battleships at fabulous expense. And maybe the smart thing to do is just build a lot of smaller, faster ships that can swarm the battleships and have torpedoes or like one or two really powerful guns, right? Because gunnery, cannon in these days, artillery is getting better and better because of the steels and the powders and everything, So the cannon on a battleship built in 1900 is vastly more powerful than something from 1850, and certainly is, radically different from anything that preceded that. So why don't we do that instead? And then there's like an economic calculus. A battleship costs a fortune. You sink a battleship, all that money's lost, right? A small ship that's got its torpedoes and maybe one or two guns doesn't cost nearly as much, which means if you lose it, it's not much less of a big deal. And you can build a whole lot of them. But more to the point, the idea is that with these little weaker, faster ships, you can actually destroy the big ships. So there's a logic to it. There's almost an economic logic to doing it. Plus, the French are also thinking in terms of, we can't compete in this big oceanic fleet thing, but what we can do is we could build these coastal fleets. The idea is that you're not going to go far away. You can have these coastal vessels. And what this will do is this will keep French coast, this will defend French coast, which is a very important thing to do, and also keep any adversary from blockading the French coast, because that's a big deal in naval warfare, blockading coasts and trying to stop other people from blockading your coast. And historically, the British are very good at blockading other people's coasts. Certainly during the Napoleonic Wars, this is what the British did. They blockaded the coast of France and the coast of Europe. So let's stop that, not by countering their battleships with our battleships, but by countering their battleships with our leading edge technology for the day, small, fast ships. And that's the way to go. Now, for various reasons, the material school had their moment. The Jeune École had its moment. But at the end of the day, things switched back, and ultimately the historical school won out. Part of it is an intellectual thing. Part of it has to do with the just experience with the technology. I think a lot of the technology that they're thinking about with the torpedoes and these cannon is ultimately not mature enough. Today's torpedoes, yeah, you could probably pull this off, but those torpedoes, those kinds of ships, not quite. Also, you have phenomenon like the Russo-Japanese War, where you actually had fleet-on-fleet action, and you could see all these amazing things that the Japanese were able to do, but also you get this sort of vivid example of battleships in action and how powerful this can be. But either way, the navies basically switch back to man, and they switch back to this idea that we need our big battleships. Now, about this question about what do you do with your navies, Mahan argued that the whole point of your fleet is to go and attack the other person's fleet. That ultimately, whatever you need to do is to destroy the fleet, because if you destroy the enemy's fleet, then all the other things that you want to do are possible. So that's the focus. Now, of course, this is important. If your purpose is to destroy an enemy's fleet, that means you need a fleet capable of doing that, which means your focus has to be on ships that can fight other ships, as opposed to ships that can do other things. And keep in mind that navies do lots of different things. You're blockading coasts, you're doing escorts, you're doing scouting, there are all sorts of tasks. You're doing amphibious operations, you're landing troops, you're supplying troops, you're transporting troops. But a ship, for fighting other ships, has got to be special. You have to design a ship for that purpose. And generally ships designed for that purpose aren't necessarily any good at doing any of the other things. But the argument is, like, don't worry about all the other stuff. As long as you've got the ships that can fight other ships and can therefore control the sea, have sea control, that's really what you want, and all the rest is kind of commentary. That's what Mahan argued. Corbett pushed back on this a little bit, saying we need to worry about lines of communication, channels of communication. Of course, he's British. He's writing about the British Empire, so you've got all these colonies that you need to be able to make sure that the colonies can commerce with one another and with Britain, and it's really important to keep these lines open. So it's a question of what do you do with your fleet and how does the fleet spend its time? Maybe you shouldn't have them chase the enemy fleet all over the planet to destroy it. Maybe there are different things that you could do, because first of all, you got to spread it out, and then you've got to do certain things with it. So he's sort of saying, like, not so fast. Castex ends up with a slightly different angle, because Castex is saying, first he comes straight out and he says, no, you got to destroy the other fleet. And that's the primary thing. But then he backs off a little bit like Corbett does, and says, well, yeah, but in truth, there are other things the navies have to do. Plus, one thing that makes Castex very different from Corbett and Mahan is that, while Mahan wants the United States to become the preeminent naval power, which ended up being the case, and Corbett's writing on behalf of the British Empire, which was then the preeminent naval power, Castex, as a French naval officer, is cognizant of the fact that France never was and never will be the preeminent naval power. And this is important because if you're never going to be more than at best number 2 or number 3, this means that maybe destroying the enemy fleet isn't actually an option, right? Maybe you can't do this because the other fleet's stronger. Maybe you have to have a different strategy. Maybe there's just other things you have to do. Or if you are going to destroy the enemy fleet, you can't do it just by like throwing your fleet against it, because maybe it'll just be destroyed. So you can be smarter about it, right? You can be smarter about how you do this. So it's with Castex, it's like, yes, let's destroy the enemy fleet, but let's think a little bit first, because that's easier said than done. So let's be a little bit smarter about the assets that we do actually have. So to bring this together, there's a question about what about today? Are there any lessons? And I think there are some really interesting lessons. First of all, the main argument for sea power, I think, remains valid. And this is the argument that Mahan wrote in the 19th century, but I think is actually true. Sea power remains essential, prerequisite for being a global power. And it's not something that's obvious to us as contemporary Americans anymore. And I believe this has to do with the fact that since World War II, America's dominance of the oceans has been unquestioned and unchallenged. And even the Soviet Navy at its highest point was never in the same league as the United States Navy. And I think this is the reality. But if this is true, then you just take for granted certain things. So you're not really thinking about it, right? What kind of naval strategy you need when you are the preeminent naval power, right? And after the Soviets, there was like nobody, right? And so like nobody came close. And then once the Soviet Union fell apart, the Russian Navy very quickly became a joke, and it's still a joke. So what do you have? Now that the Chinese Navy is suddenly becoming a big deal, people are starting to ask questions again. So it's kind of interesting. But it remains the fact that naval power is huge. Also, when we think about U.S. military history since World War II, navies haven't been on the front lines in the sense that we haven't fought any naval battles really since World War II. However, all the things that we have been doing, invading Korea, or fighting a war in Korea, fighting in Vietnam, fighting in Afghanistan, fighting in Iraq, all of our thinking about projecting force and fighting a war somewhere else, it always presupposes the fact that we dominate the seas. And because we take that as a given, we can assume that we can do these things. We can transport transport soldiers and troops and tanks and trucks and all the things that we need to transport, all the stuff that doesn't fly, we can send on ships, and we can send it really without worrying about anything, because who's going to touch us? So it's something that we've taken for granted, and I think increasingly it's something that we can no longer take for granted, both because we have the Chinese emerging as a rival, but then also there's something to be said for what the Houthis are doing. And what the Houthis are doing is they're showing that the proliferation of fairly low-cost precision weapons in the form of ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, drones, and drones in a sense are just cruise missiles. This makes it easier for even two-bit countries like, it's not even Yemen, it's a part of Yemen, it's a group that's in Yemen, of course backed by Iran, to threaten naval hegemony, to threaten the sea power in an area. I mean, it's circumscribed in an area, but it's still remarkably large. I mean, you can cover a large part of the Red Sea, for example. So it starts to matter, and it just becomes, again, something that we have to think about. I also think that there's this question of, when we're thinking about budgets and defense budgets, I think that because we forget about the role of sea power and we forget about navies, I think it's a little bit too tempting for us to underfund the Navy while we're busy funding, for instance, the Army or the Air Force. And I would argue that, ideally, in an ideal world, you do all of the above. And the United States, more than any other country in the world, can do all of the above. But if you have to at least, the extent to which it is a zero-sum game, for the United States, I still would push more towards the Navy. We have to have the Navy, and the Navy has to be powerful. And I have to agree ultimately with Mahan or Corbett in that you have to have a Navy that's capable of fighting other navies. And not just, this, you can push back against like the littoral combat ships. Like, I don't really get it. Like, I think at the end of the day, the focus needs to be on surface fleets and also submarines. I mean, it's a complicated picture, but that still remains sort of the signature value of a Navy, although it's always very hard to draw a line between sea power and naval power to security and what it does for the U.S. and our ability to have the kind of standard of living that we have, et cetera, et cetera. It's not so clear cut, but it's still real. In terms of like historical school and material school, it's Castex, Corbett, Mahan came down in favor of the historical school. They are the historical school. But that doesn't mean that we still shouldn't be asking ourselves these questions all the time with the advent of technology. I mean, like in Ukraine, everybody's been looking at the role of drones in Ukraine and thinking like, holy crap, like everything's different. But you could also argue that no, maybe nothing's different. And sometimes when I look at Ukraine, I think it's like we're in 1917 again, which is relevant because, Foch argues that ultimately nothing's changed, which means ultimately the same principles of war are always applied. And this is a matter of figuring out how to actually do it in the context of new technologies. Castex takes up that argument and says, yeah, it's true, right? At the end of the day, what happened at the end of World War I completely justified this historical school. That yes, the new technological developments caused a problem because it took us a while to figure out how to do warfare, how to apply these principles, but ultimately victory requires applying the principles, and that's what the Allies, in his view, finally were able to do in 1918. And I have a hunch that that's ultimately what is going to prevail in Ukraine. For Ukraine to win, it has to go from 1917 to 1918. Like, it's about recovering maneuver and recovering, applying the same principles that Foch was applying back in 1918. It's just trickier now because of the new technology. So I believe with that, so just to wrap it up, these are sort of the things that I find very interesting in naval strategy. And hopefully, moving forward, we're going to, I will in future episodes be looking much more closely at Mahan and at Corbett and especially Castex. Castex is somebody that I'm going to be writing about a lot because he's really very interesting. But and then of course there'll be a lot more content on military strategy in general. So thank you. Please subscribe to my Substack channel, Pax Americana, and also I'm on LinkedIn and Twitter, and I'm also going to be turning the audio for this is available as a podcast. Thank you.